Thank you, everybody. Welcome back to this section now on media and blockchain. I would like to introduce our next speaker. It is Walid Al-Saqaf, and he's the only programmer in the journalism department at Stockholm University. He's passionate about decentralization and the roots of the internet working with the media. So I think right now an important aspect of blockchain is not simply the cryptocurrency craze and also the developers that are building the platforms, but also education and communication is extremely important. And so journalism and media, we play a huge social responsibility in getting that information out to the public and also to do it in an unbiased way. So Walid Al-Saqaf will go ahead and explain that, and please welcome him to BLOXPO.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here at BLOXPO. Hopefully the rest will be joining us since we are just after the coffee break. Well, the title here is Journalism Should Not Miss the Blockchain Train. The idea is that as a journalist by profession, but computer engineer by academic credentials, as well as partially profession, I feel that I'm bridging the gap between journalism and software engineering. And I'll start today with a simple personal story. You see this car? This car is the one that changed my life. I started as a computer engineer and worked my way through that and eventually got a scholarship to University of California in Davis to pursue my higher master degrees, but this happened. And this basically is a car that actually killed a man. His name was Professor Abdulaziz, and he had been a very prominent journalist in my home country, Yemen, where I came from. He had pursued journalism to highest standards. Very high standards in making sure that journalism stands up to its premise of holding those in power accountable. So one of the typical viewpoints that he used to write in Yemen was about this: thieves do not build nations. And it basically was targeting the regime of Yemen. At the time, Ali Abdullah Saleh was quite an authoritarian dictator. And one of those very prominent message that he had in this particular story is he is referring basically to the president, saying that he must see that thieves and crooks do not build nations. It is individuals with integrity who are the great nation builders. So this journalist's one information that I missed, this journalist basically is my own father, who was killed in this traffic accident. And this led me to pursue journalism instead of computer engineering, because I felt the passion for getting this information out to the world, getting it so that people understand what's behind the scenes. And so one of the fundamental pillars that I was taught by my father was that journalism is about accountability, transparency, and integrity. And so these three pillars of journalism are embedded, engraved in me and in many people around the world who are pursuing this path. That being said, you might wonder, what does this have to do with blockchain? And so the next phase is to understand why I'm mentioning this. Journalism today is suffering from a crisis, and this crisis is basically fostered by a number of factors, from the revolution in the information age and the internet, etc. But even journalists themselves and media themselves admit that journalism is in decline. It's obviously done many things wrong when the internet came about. First, it misunderstood the internet. It underestimated what the internet can do. It ended up having them to adopt, but late and also in a very slow fashion. It ended up having them adopt it wrongly, not in the way that it was supposed to be done. And it also had led them to think and do things on the internet in a way that is legacy, connected to how journalism or media used to run in the past. And they also did not afford to invest in making journalists up to date with technologies, including the disruptive technologies. And one fundamental mistake was they maintained an excessive level of centralization. Centralization of media doesn't necessarily mean that you need as an editor to make sure that all the content beneath you is properly done. But it's centralization and ownership in the conglomerates that have grown tremendously and become very well enshrined and connected to the interest groups. So these all led to a failure that Nicholas Kaiser-Brill, who is one of the founders of Journalism +++, he said media, he is referring to media, thought of web pages as the equivalent of paper pages and tried to copy their offline product on the web. Obviously, this was a massive mistake. That's his quote. And so you see this, I often show this to my students at Södertörn University where I teach. I'm telling them that the internet was built around a very basic premise of being a network of networks. That means there's no one in charge, no central entity that turns it off and on. And then the internet itself was the basic foundation of what came after it, including the blockchain. But journalism failed the internet test, and it failed because of the reasons said before. And it's still suffering. Today, we have journalism suffering in quality, in profitability, in influence, in competitiveness, even with social media, and more gruesomely, in credibility. And this is where we really hit the major problem when it comes to today's journalism. And these are examples of why journalists are suffering. Fake news is on the rise. You can see it in social media, in various other platforms. You can see that journalists or voters who had actually voted for the supreme leader in the biggest country in the world have actually based their their decisions on fake news. So it's not only a failure by journalists to get this right, but it's also a disastrous consequence on the nations that have led to this state. Yet, these are some challenges that we are looking into and what blockchain technology is trying to offer. I'm saying here trying because we are at very early stages of development. There are examples of cases where you have startups working on combating fake news, protecting copyrights, meaning understanding intellectual rights and tracking it, decentralizing newsrooms, such as what Civil is trying to do, decentralizing social media, that's already been done by Steemit to some degree, and resisting censorship, meaning that you no longer depend on one particular platform. You are able now to disseminate information across. There's also blockchain data analysis, meaning that you can, as journalists, learn how the blockchain operates and use that data for your own reporting. Enhancing transparency, knowing that you can depend on information that comes there. It's not from a secret source, so there's reliability there. Financial sustainability, given that there's no center in control, unlike conglomerates and other media that are being owned by massive corporations. And also protecting whistleblowers in cases where you need to use blockchains to disseminate information in a way that does not lead to tracking back. And these are some of the examples of projects that are going on. And obviously, there are also many more, and these are just a snippet. Obviously, it's not enough time for me to go through all of these, but I'll give you a testament or a very strong emphasis on one thing. If we had failed in the past as journalists to catch up with the internet, let's not do the same for blockchain. This is an opportunity that we can use to recover and use the profession in ways that can actually testify to the wisdom of the media. But, and it's a very big but here, we already are seeing the media over again drumming up that this is not the case. That blockchain is not necessarily something of value, or certain cryptocurrency connected to fraud, etc., getting dominant picture in the coverage of news. So this is the problem that we're seeing, and it's not because they are, let's say, deliberately trying to do this. They mainly do not understand what the technology is. For example, a cryptographic hash function, if you ask a journalist what that means, they will just say it's gibberish. Hybrid POS or POW, proof of work or proof of stake. This is what they think this is. I mean, it's gibberish and it's not understandable, it's confusing. And that's what makes them fearful sometimes, is that journalists don't attempt to go into this field because it's just too difficult and too cryptic. And so if we think of blockchain and the internet, these two have something in common, which is decentralization, the notion that no center is in control. So if you take that forward, my proposition is basically to move from making journalism about speed in terms of getting faster to the news, or about broad breadth in that you cover almost everything imaginable. And I think that the next phase in which journalism can get a competitive edge will be in depth, in getting deeper and getting into details that people do not necessarily reach, because they can get the latest news, but they do not understand the analysis, the things behind the scenes that you need as a journalist to investigate. And so this is one of the areas that I am passionate about. It's called data-driven journalism. It's a place where only journalists are really capable of getting information from sources, databases, and others, and using that information to analyze and visualize and extrapolate and simplify to the general public, because much of this information is not necessarily out there. This is a simple illustration. I've done this study about how Twitter is used to disseminate information, and this was a case on the Kenyan terrorist attack that happened some time back, and it shows that how a center led up and propagated the messages across, and this was basically all data that's been analyzed and used. But I'm thinking maybe we can reshift it a bit and use it in a decentralized data journalism, in a way that no longer do we have one database, we actually have a blockchain in which we can have multiple streams. And this is an example of where I presented this work at the Internet Forum, and I informed them that journalists need to pay attention to this field. They need to be actively involved, do research, do study, a self-study to explore this area. And at the university here at Södertörn, I've been trying to work hard to make this reality. The video is not playing. But basically, the university is making it possible for us to dig deeper into this research and letting us use media technology research or funds for exploring how can blockchain be of value for journalism, how it can be of value for the media industry as a whole, how can we tap into this world and understand what it gives us and what it can provide. So for the sake of time, I've tried to put in one of the projects that we are working on, and it's called DDJ Blocks. It's basically an illustrative or some sort of tool that would allow journalists to go into the depths of the blockchain and get the information out, access it, analyze it, and visualize it. So this is a GitHub open source tool that you can access anytime, and what it allows you to do is, for example, get into questions of transaction. What form of transaction exists, and what does this address get, and from where, how big, how frequent, how often? And you can think of a particular example that would have been very useful for journalists to look into. You remember this case, the WannaCry ransom attack that happened across the world. Many have speculated, many have guessed, but journalists did not really know or did not have the tools to understand what this virus was about, who was getting the money, and how was it channeled around. CIA and others who are FBI and others who have been interested in this form of attacks may have done their research, but it's not open to the public. It's journalists' role to go there and see what this is about. Luckily, we had one journalist, Keith Collins. He's at the New York Times, and he did a simple script that would actually detect any activities on the WannaCry account and address, and he would report this on Twitter on a frequent basis. And the idea is that we do have a lot of blockchain explorers nowadays. You know that it's very easy to access this information. But the next step is how to make this information meaningful for the public. In a case of a WannaCry attack, it would have been very useful to have journalists who are aware of this information bringing it up and formulating it for the access of the public. So by developing this tool, we are able now to extract these transactions through the available say blockchain explorers, convert the information, which is multi-layered. We can track one address all the way to its very end, the last unspent account address, and use this information to do more analysis and visualize. For example, we've been able to know the cities where the WannaCry amounts were sent from. Not all of them give their IP addresses, but those that had were actually been recorded here. And we are able to see over time how this has changed. And so this information would have been possible to produce to the public through journalistic reports. And then you can actually look into the proliferation of how things started and where they started and who has been the one behind it and who's pushing it, etc. So this information that had often been used by investigative bureaus and blockchain analyst groups that are getting thousands of dollars, this would have been easily done through a small script if you had a little bit of knowledge of how to do this stuff. So this typical example is a WikiLeaks donation map. You can actually see this is something that I produced in about 10 minutes. You can actually go to WikiLeaks address and extract from it the transactions and see the IP addresses and link them and understand where they come from. There's also a link that one can use. And then I'd like to recap with the, let's say, conclude with an example of, you may know that in next week, there will be this anniversary of the 10,000 Bitcoin pizza that had been ordered. Has anyone ever wondered where this pizza money is? I mean, how has it evolved? Where did it go? So we can demonstrate to you right now, through the tool, how that happened. So what I did is that I extracted the information from the program through the Explorer. I actually found the address of the pizza that had delivered through Blockchain Explorer. And I was able to get to the part where the first amount of money had received. So if you notice, at the very center of this, there is a small dot. And here you can see 4 transactions. And each one of these at the very end is one of the sender and then the receiver. If you click and see these transactions, you will notice that this changes on the left. And you'll notice here, I don't know if it's clear enough, but on the left side, you will see 10,000. This is actual transaction being recorded and visualized for you to understand that this was sent and this was the date, etc. And so what you can do then is extrapolate and try to find out exactly how this information or how this particular account had actually changed over time, or to whom did it go to. And so if we take, for example, right now this case at the very center and move it further to see the network, so you'll notice that money started to move. It started to move from the first point to the other point, and each one of those is clickable. And I'm, by the way, using Kumo, which is a very useful visualization tool. So if you see that the activities over time, every single time you click on one layer, one transaction, the money flow is actually illustrated to you. So this is possible to actually demonstrate in terms of how money flows. If you had done an investigative report about the WannaCry, you'd actually find this useful to you. The next stage would be actually to moving on to the third layer. And so this would actually, over time, allow you to consider, let's say, the breadth and depth and speed as well, because each one of those nodes is connected to a date, as date stamp, that is on the blockchain. And over time, you actually will be able to map out where the final unspent transactions are. So you will notice that the graph gets wider and wider and wider. And this means that each one of these transactions that started with just one has actually proliferated. And that's why I like on Reddit, there was a discussion on this saying that, okay, if you had not actually bought that much with the pizza, but the thing is that all of this would have not have happened. So you actually have paid, say, provided the world with a great advantage of thinking of these enormous transactions would not have happened because of that particular, and each one would be up to the tens or less. So the bottom line is that this information is accessible, and you can get it, and you can utilize it, and you can publish it, and then you will have an edge. And once you have an edge, your journalism will be better. So to conclude, I'd like to bring you up to there was a discussion at the Data Journalism event recently and asking what was your New Year's resolution. My New Year's resolution was that to make journalists able to extrapolate and use this blockchain data for their reporting. One of the responses was this: data journalists, in their majority, should first master Excel, and blockchain, compared to that, sounds as a rocket science. So, in my opinion, we should always aim to the stars, not settle for what is less, but what is more. And so I've committed myself to have my students be the first blockchain programmers in journalism. Thank you very much.